Now, we can suffer losses in this life. We can have real, true losses, but that is very different to being eternally injured. I'd like you to open up today to the book of Genesis, but if you could turn to Genesis 28. I don't always bring Father's Day or Mother's Day messages. Occasionally I do, sometimes I don't. But I do today want to look at some highlights from the life of one of the patriarchs, Jacob. There's an expression that follows Jacob, this idea of the God of your father. The God of your father. Jacob was son to Isaac and a grandson to Abraham. He's the man who gave the world the 12 tribes of Israel, who would ultimately become the nation of Israel. Now, if you're going to pick a father in the Bible to talk about on Father's Day, you would probably bypass Jacob. He doesn't shine necessarily in terms of fatherhood, but he has some high points. And when he needed to bless his sons, he did. But by and large, Jacob was a man who struggled throughout most of his life with himself, with his family, with others, even with God. It seems that most of Jacob's life was uphill until he came to a point of surrender and submission to God. And what I want to do today is look at aspects of Jacob's life where we are reminded that he came from a very blessed family. Imagine having Isaac and Abraham as your father. But the fact that he was who he was meant that he stood in line to receive the promises God had made to his fathers. That's the real point. The promises that God had made to his father Isaac and to his grandfather Abraham would land in Jacob's account. And as Christians, there are blessings that we have because God is our Father. The Jehovah of the Old Testament is the Jesus of the New Testament. So in Genesis 28, we find Jacob. I was going to say this is in Jacob's youth, but he's like 40. He's like 40. Now he does live to 147, so we could call this his youth. His youth. And in Genesis 28, Jacob is leaving home, but not under nice, happy circumstances. He's leaving home because he betrayed his brother. He pretends to be his brother Esau, who was a very hairy man and pretends to be Esau, has coats of animal skins wrapped around his arms and things, his body, and he fools his father so that he can receive the blessing of the firstborn. And he offends Esau so deeply that his twin says that when dad is dead, I'll kill him. I'll kill him. So that's why Jacob had to leave home. Not the brightest of circumstances, is it? If I stay and my father Isaac passes away, then I'm a dead man. I've offended. I've duped him twice now. Twice. But look at verse 1 of Genesis 28. Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him. He didn't deserve a blessing, but he's going to get one. He's going to get one. And charged him and said to him, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. So the command is go to your mother's side of the family, to Uncle Laban, and there you need to seek a wife from among his daughters. Now look at verse 3. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be an assembly of peoples, and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. There were blessings that God had given to Abraham that Jacob was going to participate in, but he had to be very careful, because Jacob could complicate things by marrying badly. He could complicate things by marrying badly. Esau had already married badly. He'd already married from among the pagan women. In fact, he would do so again, really in spite or to spite his parents. He knew how to hurt them. So he married pagans. But the command to Jacob from his father is very specific. You need to go and marry within the family. It's here that you're going to preserve and protect the covenant blessings. For Christians today, it is the will of God for an unmarried Christian man or woman to find another Christian man or woman, respectively, to marry. And if God doesn't lead you to one of them, then you wait. And then you might have to keep waiting. And the reason why you've got to keep waiting is because the blessings of a godly marriage, the blessing of two believers coming together who love God, who love each other, who are willing to sort out problems biblically, the blessing is so great that it's worth the wait. In fact, to have that kind of marriage is so important that if God doesn't lead you into that kind of marriage, then don't get married. Don't get married. Just wait upon the Lord. But I've seen over the years that those who have that desire, God grants them that desire eventually. Or he gives them grace to wait. Because the worst thing in life for a Christian is not to be single, it's to be in disobedience to God. That's the real tragedy of life. It's not to be on your own. I mean, many of us are going to breathe our last, not with our spouse around us. We know, right? It's not guaranteed. And so for one Christian to marry another Christian, this is God's will. It's God's will. And you don't want to get out of God's will. We see it from the Old Testament itself. And if Jacob followed this advice, not that his family life was perfect as we shall see, but he did obey his father's instruction. Now on Jacob's journey, if you look down at verse 10, it says he went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place, stayed there all night because the sun had set. No lights, no clocks, no lamp, right? It's the sun that determines how much you get to move. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. His pillow was a rock, a stone. It says he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and it reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. And look at what happens in verse 13. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. Now, Abraham is his grandfather, but he's called his father. These were the covenant promises. The land on which you lie I'll give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and east, to the north and south, and in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. In John 1, Jesus identified himself as that great ladder that came down from heaven. And the promise that God made to Abraham and then to Isaac, and now it's repeated through to Jacob, is that he's going to give him and his descendants a land, and that in your seed all families of the earth shall be blessed. From this nation, all nations are going to get blessed, because when God sent his son Jesus Christ, he was from the tribe of Judah, the line of David. He was born a Jew, so that Jews and Gentiles could be saved. And look at what God says in verse 15. Behold, I am with you, and I'll keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, and I'll not leave you until I've done what I've spoken to you. You see, when Jacob leaves home, he's not leaving covered in glory. He's left as a man who's cheated his brother. He's not leaving home on a high note. But even then, God promises to bless him and to be with him because of promises made to his fathers. And what we see from Genesis through to Revelation is God's faithfulness despite our unfaithfulness. God does the right thing by us even when we do the wrong thing by him. This comes out again and again in the life of Jacob and the other patriarchs. And then if you skip down to verse 20 of Genesis 28, it says, Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, God, if you do all these things for me, so that I come back to my father's house again in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Not just my father's God, but my God. Jacob knew that he had to make a decision himself to make the true God his God. And he says, if God will look after me and he will feed me and he'll give me clothes, and these are things we worry about today. We worry about all these things today, same things. We're going to eat and drink and sleep and the clothes and all those kinds of things. And he says in verse 22, And this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. This is, I think, the earliest reference to this thing called tithing, giving a tenth. Now, the New Testament just tells us to be generous. To be generous. So for some it's going to be that. For many it's going to be more than the tenth. But when Katie and I were first married, and this shows you how old at least I am, a friend of ours gave us these sermon cassettes. So this afternoon, parents, tell your children what cassettes are. Maybe show them a cassette to show that they're very real. And we got a whole set about how to have a good marriage. How to have a good marriage. And there was one cassette on finances. And the pastor just said, and it's always stayed with me. He said, give 10%, save 10%, spend the rest. Give 10, save 10, spend the rest. Now, it's not a bad principle. It's something that you can live by. Now, if you've never done it, you'll say it's impossible. But when you do it, you're amazed at not only how God provides for you, but how he abundantly provides for you. Christians that don't give, they never know the goodness of God, the financial freedom that comes when you honour him and you see him multiply and bless you in ways you just can't even dream, you can't even imagine that he could do for you. And so this is the earliest time when tithing, giving is mentioned, and it was just entirely from Jacob's bag. He says, I'm just going to give you this amount. Okay? So this is how it sort of all began. Now, between Genesis 29 and 31, we're going to fast forward as many as 20 years. Jacob is going to have 12 sons, one daughter. Oh, it sounds wonderful, and it was. But to 4 different women. Not so good. Now, it wasn't all his fault in the sense that father-in-law swapped over daughters on his wedding night. Terrible blow. Very painful. Very painful, I'm sure. And so he has two. And then, of course, the wife he really loved couldn't have children. And the wife he didn't love so much had children. And then the two wives had this fertility war. And they suggest that Jacob each take one of their handmaids and not quite the status of a wife, but so he is procreating through 4 women, and it becomes a mess. Becomes a mess. Yes, polygamy was there in the Bible, but it certainly doesn't promote it. Certainly doesn't act like this is such a wonderful idea. It never really resolves problems. Among families. It never really resolves even the problems of infertility. It just brings more problems later on. And there is this constant tension between Jacob and his father-in-law Laban. Because despite the tension between these two, Jacob has been a wonderful blessing to Laban and to his livestock and to his family. Jacob comes as a rainmaker. He's a financial rainmaker for his father-in-law. He has made his father-in-law a wealthy man through his actions and through his industry. But even that relationship sours at the end. If you look at Genesis 31, says, Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all of this wealth. Jacob went through this kind of, this planned way of increasing his livestock at the expense of his father-in-law's livestock. You read the account, it's sort of very hard to sort of understand exactly what is happening, but through sheer ingenuity, Jacob has come out on top, and Laban is upset. He's upset. And look at verse 2. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, his face, and indeed it was not favourable toward him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. 20 years ago, God said, I'm going to bring you back. Now it's time for Jacob to go home. It's time for him to go home. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field and to his flock in verse 4 and said to them, I see your father's countenance, it is not favourable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. Notice that expression there. Your father, he hates me, but the God of my father has been with me. And this is the beginning of many parallels in this chapter. My father-in-law, I've had such a hard time. But the God of my father, he has been faithful. We will all have human disappointments in families, outside of families. But God's faithfulness to us is steadfast. Look at verse 6. And you know, with all my might I have served your father, yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But look at verse 7. But God did not allow him to hurt me. Now, we can suffer losses in this life. We can have real, true losses, but that is very different to being eternally injured or ruined. We can be hurt and we can suffer loss, but no Christian can say, I've been ruined by that. Bankruptcy cannot ruin you if you're a Christian. Can't ruin you if you're a Christian. Losing a loved one cannot ruin you, cannot devastate you as a Christian. Oh, I know it's devastating. I know it's hard. I understand that. But we know that God gives grace and help in all those situations. Look at verse 9. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. Look down at verse 26, verse 26, we have Laban now talking to his son-in-law. Laban's talking to him. He says in verse 26, "What have you done that you have stolen away unknown to me and carried away my daughters like captives taken with the sword?" Now, Laban is really putting it on here, being very melodramatic. Right? They're trying to shame it. He's trying to shame his son-in-law, trying to shame him. As though Jacob was sort of safe to stay. Look at what he says in verse 27. "Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and not tell me? For I might have sent you away with joy and songs, with timbrel and harp." Yeah, really? He's going to hire a band for his son-in-law that he's really angry with? Yeah. And look at verse 28. "And you do not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now you have done foolishly in so doing." But look at verse 20. This is from Laban's own mouth. It's from Laban's own mouth. "It is in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father spoke to me last night." Right? Even Laban says, "Jacob, I really wanted to come after you, but the God of your father, he spoke to me. He said, 'Hands off Jacob. Don't touch him.' In fact," he says, "be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad." Even Jacob's enemy had God speak to him. Even our enemies, quote unquote, can only harm us as much as God allows them to. We know that from the book of Job. Satan could only go so far. God was never out of control in Job's life. God was never to the side in Job's life. And then if you look at the end of Genesis 31, look at verse 51. "Then Laban said to Jacob, 'Here is this heap and here is this pillar which I place between you and me. This heap is a witness and this pillar is a witness. They will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me for harm.'" They're promising not to have any further conflicts, not going to harm one another anymore. This dispute is over. And look at what it says in verse 53. "The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father judge between us." God's going to be our witness. But then it says at the end of the verse, "And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac." It's another word for God. By the God of his father Isaac. That's why it says in Proverbs, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Why does Jacob have so much trouble when he gets married and all sorts of stuff? Well, a lot of it was because of how he treated his family before he was married. Laban treats Jacob the way Jacob treated Esau and his father. Jacob was getting some really hard but really necessary medicine. That as you treat others, so you get treated often enough. But God was using this in the patriarch's life. Now, it's good news, I suppose, that Jacob gets to leave Laban's home and really gets to have his own family in a different place. So he's going home, right? He's going home, and that's a blessing. That's a blessing. But as he heads back to home territory, guess who's been living there all those years? Esau. But God has blessed Esau as well. God has given him abundant blessing. He's increased his livelihood and his assets and his family. Esau is a formidable man. And with Jacob going home, he has to face the prospects of running into Esau. The best thing is for him to be reunited with Esau and to try and resolve things somehow. And so in Genesis 32, the very night before the reunion, Jacob has this prevailing with the angel. But if you look at verse 3 of Genesis 32, look at verse 3. Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, speak thus to my lord Esau. My lord Esau, there's respect there. Thus your servant Jacob says, I've dwelt with Laban and stayed there till now, of oxen, donkeys, flocks, male, female servants. I've sent them to tell my lord that I may have found favour in your sight. But look at what happens, verse 6. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you. Now that does sound good, but look what it says, and 400 men. Why does he have to bring 400 men? Why not a dozen? Have a nice intimate reunion. I mean, 400 means it's coming to get you. He's coming to get you. He's coming to take away your wives and your livestock and whatever you carry with you. This is the worst news possible. It's the worst news possible. And so Jacob is greatly afraid and distressed in verse 7. He divides the people that were with him, the flocks, the herds, camels, into two companies. And he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company, which is left, will escape. He says, I'm going to try and save half my assets. I'm going to try and keep 50%. Right? That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing. But look at verse 9. Then Jacob said, look at who he's praying to. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country, to your family, and I'll deal well with you. I'm not worthy the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant, for I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. He said, God, when I left my home, I had nothing. I come back, I got two companies. I got loads of people and livestock. He's right, he wasn't worthy of any of God's mercies, as we are not worthy of any of his mercies. And then he says in verse 11, deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother with the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. You know what Jacob's doing? He's repeating back God's promises to him. God promised him, and Jacob says, God, you promised me. That's what we're supposed to do with God's promises. Remind God of them. Remind God of them. Our kids remind us of our promises. And I think sometimes a few other things that I never quite said. Or I can't remember saying what I might have said. Remind God of his promises. And so the night before this dreaded reunion, Jacob has that wrestling match with this man. But Jacob says that he had met with God and wrestled with an angel. And that night God blessed him, but God hurt Jacob with a halt. He walked with a limp the rest of his days because of that all-night wrestling match with this angel. And I used to love wrestling as a kid, and you wrestle 5-10 minutes. That's exhausting. Try and wrestle for 8 hours, 9-10 hours. Think of the adrenaline and the exhaustion. It's like being in a washing machine, for all night. And God blesses him, and he wounds him, as it were. But essentially, they have this very wonderful reunion. Esau doesn't kill him. He doesn't kill him. He blesses him. And God himself was with Jacob. God could be trusted. Now, let me fast forward here. Go to Genesis 46. Genesis 46. This time, Jacob really is old. There's a great famine in the land, and his favourite son, Joseph, born to his beloved wife Rachel, has been sold as a slave by the brothers that hated him many years earlier. And of course, Joseph has wonderfully prospered in Egypt the way his father Jacob prospered with Laban. And I won't go into all the ins and outs of that story, but part of Joseph's strategy in getting his father to Egypt to safety during the famine is to make sure that his younger brother Benjamin, also of Rachel, is sent back to Egypt first. And if you look at verse of Genesis 46, we read this today. He has to go back to Egypt to avoid famine, but the problem is he's out of the land of promise. It's a great risk for him, but God has promised him. Look at what God says to Israel in verse 2. He says, Jacob, Jacob, verse 3, I'm God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. We've heard that earlier when God tells Jacob to leave his home and go to Laban's home. And yet if he returns back to his land and God's going to be with him again, now he has to leave to go to Egypt. He's an old man. He's an old man now. No one likes to relocate. Right? At that age, you want to stay home. You want to be with what's familiar. But he's got to go. God is with Jacob in his youth. He's going to be there in his old age. He's going to bless him. In Genesis chapter 48, we have Jacob close to death. And he's going to bless his sons. He's reunited with Joseph, who is second under Pharaoh. And look at verse 15 of Genesis 48. He blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day. Earlier on he said, God, if you'll just feed me and clothe me, I'll give you a tenth back. Now as an old man he says, God, you fed me, you looked after me, you did everything for me. Look at verse 16. The angel who's redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into the multitude in the midst of the earth. And in verse 21 of Genesis 48, he gets a promise out of his son Joseph. He says to Joseph, behold, I'm dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Joseph, you're going to come back one day. Now, it's going to be in a box. It's going to be his bones. But he would come back. Jacob, as an old man, says, the God of my fathers has been faithful to me. He's been entirely faithful. I can count on him. Feast time and famine time. I mean, if there's no food in the promised land, he's going to take me to Egypt. And he's going to make it very clear I've got to go there. God has a way of getting to us. And then if you go to Genesis 49, verse number 24, he praises his son Joseph again. His bow remained in strength. The arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. For there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. And look at verse 25. The God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you. He's passing on the blessing of God to his son. The blessings he enjoyed via Isaac and Abraham, he's going to pass on to his children. Now, every Christian father wants to do that. They all want to do that. Despite Jacob's problems, despite the problems in his home, despite the favoritism he showed to Joseph that caused all manner of problems, he wanted to pass on the blessing of God to his children. The blessing doesn't stay with us, does it? It doesn't stay with us. Our time in this world runs very quickly. Our race is over very soon. And the things that we acquire, the things we save, we know that likely going to be for someone else. We're not going to use it all. It's going to be for someone else. Jacob extends the blessing of God to his son. And then finally today, I want you to go to Genesis 50. Genesis 50, because Jacob has died at this stage. It is at 147. And you know what his no good 10 sons think? Now Dad's dead. Joseph is going to get revenge. He's been nice to us all this time, but now that Dad is dead and he has Benjamin, his full brother, he is going to get revenge on us and destroy us. That's what they think. And what's really ironic is that if you look at verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. Now, if he did repay them, they are in for an awful time. Years of jail, right? Years of jail, beatings, everything else, if they get what they deserve. Now look at verse 16. So they sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, Joseph, there was this conversation we want to remind you of that Dad said to us. The problem is he probably didn't say it. But it's here. It's here. It's really interesting because in verse 17, they quote their father as saying this: I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants, look at the wording, of the God of your father. They probably made it up, but they got the right words in, didn't they? They were right about that. Joseph, our father said, forgive them, because they are servants of the God of your father. Here, they're reminding their brother of those covenant blessings. Joseph, be benevolent, be magnanimous, be merciful. The God of your father is going to bless you. So even though they probably made it up, they are onto something. They're onto something. They reminded Joseph of his relationship with the God of his father. So let's put all this together. Jacob lived under a lot of sunshine. He lived under the sunshine of God's covenant faithfulness, as we do today as believers. We have many promises as God's children. Despite Jacob's faults and double dealings, the God of his father Isaac and Abraham was his father. Let me ask you this question. Can you count on the same kind of blessings that you have in Christ? Can you see the hand of God and his faithfulness despite your lack of faithfulness? Jacob is the man we least expect for God to bless the way he did, but he really did, because he is merciful to sinners. He's merciful to the undeserving and to the unworthy. He really is. And so this Father's Day, think of Isaac and Abraham and Jacob, the God of your father. Think about his covenant faithfulness. He kept Jacob in his youth, in his middle age, and in his later years. His mercy followed him all the days of his life, as it will with us.